participants in the conference. I'm very happy to welcome you in this session. I'm happy to welcome our speakers and all those who deemed it possible to take part, to join us. It's the fourth time that we are getting together. We started even before this conference was organized. So let me briefly repeat what I already mentioned during the roundtable discussion earlier. Education is not a less risky area of activities than healthcare, because the stakes are very high and the cost of error is very high. So you can't just start implementing some novelty without understanding how it works and what implications it is going to bring about. So you can really inflict serious harm on people, just like in healthcare. So it's very important to be able to communicate in the community of professionals, to have the results of the experience, not restricted to the narrow boundaries of the activities that we do day to day. So what's really important is the breadth of vision, being able to see the experience that people have, not only in this country, but also worldwide. As you see, this year has proven the relevance of our session. So they were asking us, so why are we focusing on pedagogical communication? Why wouldn't you call it pedagogy or didactics? But we were persistent, and now you can see why. Those schools, universities, educational institutions who've been able to put together the right communication strategy in spring when everybody was transferred to a remote, those succeeded. Others have got very negative experience. So it turned out to be difficult to continue with the educational process without attendance. Looking at the smiles of my foreign participants, I'd like to make sure if you're satisfied with the translation. Just nod if you are, please. It feels like you are, let's hope. So therefore, it's very important to study and promulgate this experience. Those who have taken part in the work of our session earlier know that we're trying to avoid a situation where we split participants into groups, experts and laymen, lay people, those who are sitting on the rostrum and those who are sitting in the room. Well, technology, unfortunately, does not allow us to ensure the equality of all participants, so we're not going to be equal in being able to take part in the discussion. So just to offset this a bit, I'll try to moderate this session kind of informally. I would also like to welcome separately Dr. Jennifer Robbins from the South African University, because we were preparing this session today together, and she is a co-moderator of this session. But for technical reasons, her participation as moderator will be limited by keeping an eye on the English language questions in the chat feed. So the procedure will be like this. First, we are going to listen to all the presentations, and you're welcome to enter questions to them, but answers will only be provided in the Q&A session afterward. Also, we have a certain problem with Maria Lebedev. She hasn't yet been able to join us, so maybe we'll have to skip her time slot and allow her an opportunity a little bit later. So let's start. The first presentation will be from Dr. Jennifer Roberts, Associate Professor at South African University in Pretoria. She wonderfully combines a deep researcher collaborating with international journals, and also a practitioner with an experience both in distance and attended teaching. She may look harmless and scientific, but when she is telling us stories, as when she is taking away knives from her school children during lessons. You start feeling that she's quite a serious person. Also, Jennifer has been teaching me to smile for a second year running. She believes I'm too serious, so she regularly checks on me if I do smile a bit. So I have a pleasure to give the floor to her.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here. I'm just waiting for the PowerPoint presentation to come up.
Большое спасибо за приглашение.
Так, простите, у нас какие-то
I'm sorry, I'm still not seeing the PowerPoint, so I thought that will start until I see that.
Так, что случилось?
So what happened?
Так, я прошу прощения, у нас сразу же
I
предвиденные проблемы. И ужасные мы не можем убрать хотя бы вот этот фоновый шум. Так, Дженнифер, вторая попытка.
Jennifer, second try. I apologize.
Okay, so once again, I can't see the PowerPoint, so I'm not sure, and I can't hear what is being said in the background because the sound is not very good. So I don't know if you can tell me what is happening with the PowerPoint.
Так, now I see you in
Ah,
PowerPoint
okay.
as well. Let's start.
Yes, now I can see it. Great. Okay. All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm presenting to you today from Johannesburg in South Africa, where it is the middle of summer. It's 34 degrees outside, so it's a very hot day. So what I'm going to be talking to you today about is academic research, particularly in distance learning and online learning. And I'm going to be looking at what has happened in Russia and doing a small comparison to South Africa. Next slide, please. Okay, when we think of a higher education institution, there's normally three pillars to the mission of the higher education institution. And what we always focus on is teaching and learning. That's our own teaching practice. But we also forget that another pillar is community engagement, which we're not going to talk about today. And a very important aspect is also the research aspect, which we are going to be concentrating on today. Next slide, please. Okay, well, while we're waiting for the next slide, let me just say to you here, what is actual research? And one of the reasons for research is to provide evidence to affect your practice. It's all very well when we come up with practice, but it's not evidence-based, and it works both ways. So practice informs evidence, and evidence informs practice. Okay, next slide, please. Now, this slide, when it comes on, is actually a rather interesting one that I got from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And it gives the purposes of research. Can I please have that slide? Okay, so here are some of the purposes. This is what I'm not sure if everybody's with me because it looks like I'm frozen, but I'll just continue speaking. Okay, there we go. So it's to add to the body of knowledge. And most important is the one there that says is to find the evidence to inform practice. And we so often go ahead with practice when we haven't actually got evidence base for it. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so now we've talked about research in general, but I want to specifically talk about the academic field of distance education. And distance education is a relatively new field, and what defines an academic field is the amount of research that comes from that particular field. And in distance education, and particularly online learning, it's only been since about the 1980s that evidence-based research has been published. And there's been a criticism of the field because of the lack of theoretical frameworks, etc. So to counter this, Olaf Richter from Germany in 2009 developed a categorization of research levels. And he categorized research into three levels. We're talking at the macro level, the meso level, and the micro level. The research at the macro level involves international global issues, for example, globalization, equity, access, new theories, etc. At the meso level, it's more national and it's more institutional and it's management and policies. And at the micro level, which is a very important level, it involves teaching and learning and distance education. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we've spoken about the academic field of distance education, we wanted to look at and find empirical evidence for what has been going on in publication of research from both Russia, and we thought we'd compare it to South Africa as well. And why? Well, both countries are part of the Brics Consortium, and the Brics Consortium consists of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And we're all classified as developing economies. So there's a lot of similarity. So this is part of a much bigger project where we're going to look at the publications from each of those countries. But today we're looking particularly at Russia and with a small comparison to South Africa. Next slide, please. Okay, in the next slide, we're looking at Olaf Richter's classification, as I said, into the macro, the meso, and the micro. And within each of those three levels, there are subcategories of areas of research. And what we're going to be looking at is identifying and classifying all the Russian articles on distance education and online learning and the South African ones and see where they fit into this classification. So as I said, you can see at the macro level, we're talking about theories, teaching systems, research methods, down to the micro on the right, where we're looking at instructional design, interaction, and learner characteristics. Next slide, please. Okay, while we wait for that slide, let me continue with it. I'm going to talk a little bit about methodology, because in any good research, you always have to explain how you got to your scientific evidence. But very simply, we looked at all the published articles in Scopus listed journals. And we looked at South African authors, Russian authors, and I searched words for the articles with distance education, online learning, and e-learning. And once we had created that database of all those research articles, we then coded them according to that framework that I just showed you from Richter. And for an analysis, we've just for today done a descriptive analysis of authorship details. Next slide, please. And this is where we're now going to come to some of the results. And I think that's what most people are interested in. And this is just a snapshot of some of the results. If I can have that slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so here we're looking at the Russian authored distance education online learning Scopus published journal articles. And what you can see here is from the period 2015 onwards, there have actually only been 49 articles published in Scopus by Russian authors. But what is encouraging to see here is that there is an upward trend. And you can see from 2007 onwards, you can see 2008 and 2009, there was a substantial increase. 2020, there slide. When the next slide comes up, what it's doing is it's showing which Scopus journals the Russian authors are publishing in. And yeah, it's quite interesting. You can see that the most number of articles, which is 7, was published in this journal, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, but it is an educational. But what is interesting about this slide is you can see that all but 2 of the journals that you're publishing in are actually Russian language journals, although there are Scopus international journals. And there's only 2 journals that are in English. I think that's quite significant for when we do an analysis just now. Okay, next slide. In this next slide, we're actually looking at what the South Africans are doing in terms of their publications in Scopus registered journals. And you can see what's happening here is many of the South Africans are publishing in dedicated, top-notch, particularly dedicated ODL journals. And you can see most of the publications are in this, the first one here called Arodal. And Arodal is situated in Athabasca in Canada, and they encourage articles from developing countries, and they really help you to publish. So you can see the effect in South Africa that so many people have published in that journal. Also, an important journal is Distance Education from Australia, and I think that's commonly known as one of the top journals in ODL. South Africans are also publishing in the Turkish Journal of Online Learning. And interesting here is that many authors from India, also one of the Brics countries, are publishing in that journal. And I think the cream of the crop is the British Journal of Online Technology. But you can see, as with Russia, South Africans in their Scopus list have got 2 local journals, the African Education Review and the South African Journal of Education. Next slide, please. In the next slide, it's just a quick repeat of Olaf's framework to remind us that there are 15 different categories, because we're going to look to find gaps and see where we are publishing and where we're not. So this is just a reminder of that. So we can move to the next slide and we can look at some of these. And the first slide we're going to look at is just a comparison at the highest levels, at those 3 levels. On the next slide, please. Which is a comparison between South Africa and Russia at the macro, meso, and micro levels. And now it's no surprise and no criticism at all, but we can see that at the macro level, which is actually at your very top end conceptual level, there are very few publications from both South Africa and Russia. In fact, there's nothing from Russia and very few from South Africa. But when we get to the meso level, we can see the Russians have got 40% of your articles are at that level, which is your management type of categories, and 60% of your publications are at the micro, which is the teaching and learning. And I mean, even in South Africa, it's higher, it's 65. And you can see there's some international figures at the bottom as well. So we're not quite the same as international. Internationally, there's a little bit more at that macro level, but both our countries aren't doing well there. Next slide, please. Here we want to look at, and I'm only looking at the meso and the micro level, because at the macro level, there was nothing from Russia. And we look at, in the blue is the Russian publications, and orange is the South Africans. And I'm just looking where the red arrows are, because these are the gaps. These are areas within Olaf's framework where we are not actually publishing very well. And the first one is number 7, which is costs and benefits. And, you know, I think this should change and become far more important in the light of what's happened with COVID in the last year. So many more contact universities are now offering online learning. And let's look at what happened in the UK and England when all the students went back recently to university and had to go straight into lockdown. And what the students started demonstrating, saying they must be paying lesser fees because online learning must be cheaper than face-to-face. Now, we need evidence to prove that or otherwise. And there's nobody really working in that field, particularly at the moment. It used to be covered by Professor Thomas Holzman. He did a lot of work in that, but Thomas has sadly retired. And I think there's a big gap there that we could fill. The other one, where you've got nothing from Russia and very little from South Africa, is category 11. And category 11 is learner support services. And then also so important is category 12, which is quality assurance, because there's always been this general feeling everywhere that online and distance education is secondary to face-to-face. And I don't believe that's true at all. But we have to have quality assurance to be able to prove that. The next slide, please. This next slide is just looking at the micro level, and what's really fascinating here, I'm sorry, it looks like we've just, okay. I'm not sure if everybody can see me, if I'm still connected, but it looks like we've definitely got space to do more at the micro level. Okay, then can we have the final slides, please? And the final slides is a summary of what we've just said now. And so the summary here is that there's an upward trend in distance education and online learning publications from Russian authors, which is great. But most Russian authored articles are published in Russian language Scopus journals. Now, South African authors are mainly publishing in dedicated distance education English Scopus journals. Although what is important to note is that less than 10% of South Africans have English as their first language. Our first language, with more than 25% of the population speaking it, is actually Zulu, and then isiXhosa. Even Afrikaans, there are far more Afrikaans-speaking people than English. Okay, then we're going to say in both South Africa and Russia, there are very few articles on the macro level. Research levels at the meso and micro level are similar for both countries. We have gaps in research, in costs and benefits, learner support and quality assurance, and also in interaction and communication. And on my final slide, if you can show that, please, what I'm just saying here's a prime example of making research usable, where we've taken research, published research from the mind, brain, and science education fields, and used that to develop a program for lifelong learning between Russia and South Africa. And it's been run at the High School of Economics in Nizhny Novgorod in collaboration with Professor Khost from UNISA and Professor Yulia Platonova from Nizhny Novgorod, at the HSC there. And that's a prime example to show where this program has been influenced and by the actual research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for your exciting presentation that lays the groundwork for the whole of our session. I'm now passing the floor to Liz Maria Blaszke, Director of Master's Program of Management of Technology Intensive Education, if my Russian translation is correct. So she is now working at the forefront of implementing educational technologies in actual learning. So while preparing for the session, I already mentioned this to Liz Maria. She got an award for the best disciplined participant. She admired me many times by the meticulousness and of her activities. And so I was and she contributed a lot to putting a smile on my face while preparing the session. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Gennady. It's so nice to be with all of you today. I am here in southern Germany.
Коллеги, но мы не видим ни экранов,
and I would like to talk to you about
ничего.
How we can promote development of self-determined learning skills in our
Я слышу Анну,
students.
слышу
The topic
эфирный
of this session is on communication, and
звук,
so it's really
где мы себя
critical
можем
that we
видеть.
find ways to allow our students to be self-determined while also...
звук есть. Вот он, привет. Отлично. Я надеюсь, кто-то еще присоединился к нам.
While also
и не
supporting
убежал.
communication between the instructor and the
Очень
student.
громко это все.
Next slide,
Так вот,
please.
наша секция посвящена...
Next slide. Thank you. So one of the questions I'm often asked is, when we're promoting self-determined learning, why do we need to do this? Why is it important that our students are self-determined? Well, primarily, it's because our students need jobs. we're being faced with a situation where industry is pushing back and saying, we need to prepare our students better for the workforce. And I also draw on my own experience prior to academia when I was working here in Germany for a small software company called SAP. And one of the things that I noticed when I was working there is we needed employees that could start from day one. They needed to have a wide diversity of skills in order to adapt to the complexities of a quickly changing environment. And so these are some of the skills that our employers are looking for today. The other aspect that we need to consider is that our students need to learn for life. What they learn right now isn't necessarily what they'll be applying for the rest of their life. They'll need to continually learn, to continually build on their knowledge. They'll need to know how to learn and also to find the information that they need when they need it. Next slide, please. The theory of pedagogy is one on self-determined learning. And this particular theory resonated with me because of the fact that we were really looking at a holistic approach to teaching and looking at ways to support students to become lifelong learners. Now, pedagogy is the study of self-determined learning, and it uses this holistic approach for developing learner capabilities and competencies. And the learner is really the major agent of their learning. This learner agency is then the primary principle of pedagogy, which means the learner is the center of the learning experience. The next principle is that of capability and self-efficacy, and that's developing the learner in order for them to apply the different competencies and skills that they acquire into their work environment. So they might have the competency to do something in one environment. Capability means they'll be able to apply it into a new environment, a new and unique environment. Another principle of pedagogy is reflection and metacognition, and that's the ability to think about not just what you've learned, but how you've learned it. So there's an aspect of metacognition that comes into this. The fourth aspect, and this is where I think technology plays a really big role, pedagogy focuses on nonlinear design, and that means the learner can learn and follow a learning path of their own choice. So there's no specific design on how they approach their learning. Next slide, please. One way of looking at this is to say, okay, we've got this learner maturity and autonomy that we require of the learner, and we want the learner to move from pedagogy to andragogy to pedagogy. So by looking at pedagogy as a continuum, we're moving from a didactic form of learning where the learner is engaged, where there's a passive presentation of information, where they're absorbing information from the instructor, really the lecture type of instruction. And then when we move to andragogy, the student is actually becoming more self-directed in their learning, and they're making decisions about their learning, how they'll organize their learning. And then finally at pedagogy, they're really determining what they will learn and how they will learn it. And one way to look at this is that the learner, as they become more mature and they use more autonomy and less instructor control and course structure is required as they become more self-determined. So some students might be at one level, whereas others might be at another. So this is why it's very important to understand where your students are coming from. And that's why this holistic approach and looking at the student needs from this perspective is very critical. Next slide. So one of the ways that we do this in realizing pedagogy is to create learner-centered environments. And this is just an example of some of the different aspects you can bring into a course to make it more learner-centered. You need to give students opportunities to explore and to create new things. Opportunities to collaborate not just with others in the classroom, but people outside of the classroom as well as they create new information. They should have an opportunity to connect with each other. And again, not just with those in the classroom, but those outside of the classroom. They also should be able to share their work so that they'll have an opportunity to get feedback from others, as well as to learn from the other students in the classroom. Another key aspect is reflection, because they're thinking about what they've learned, they're thinking about how they've learned it, and then they're applying it within their professional work lives. And so it's very critical that in order to create an environment where it's really focused on the learner, that we bring these aspects into our classrooms. Next slide, please. A lot of people will ask me then, well, if the student is becoming more responsible for their learning, if they're directing it and determining it, what's the role of the teacher? I mean, they're the teacher. We don't need teachers then, right? I want to clarify that pedagogy is not autodidacticism. It's not where the learner is making, is doing all of the learning on their own. The instructor is there as the guide, the mentor, the guru, coach, the resource. I've seen this play out in a number of different environments where the instructor is working in a self-determined learning environment, and the role of the instructor changes from one in which they are handing over the information and giving the lectures, and the student is actually making those decisions and looking for information themselves, and the instructor is guiding them through that process. And so the role of the instructor, or what Stuart Haas calls the learning leader, becomes even more important. It's not diminished, actually even more emphasized. And from talking with instructors who have practiced this approach, they say they actually learn a lot more through this process because they're being forced to get out of their own comfort zones and their own traditional forms of teaching and to engage in new forms of teaching. And so it's important to realize that if you are an instructor that's applying self-determined learning, your role is not one where you're taking a backseat and doing nothing in the classroom, but it's really a much more important role because you're reinforcing things for your students, you're supporting them, you're guiding them throughout their learning process and their learning journey. This is a list of some of the key aspects or characteristics of a learning leader from Stuart Haas. They're able to manage ambiguity in learning. They can foster engagement with the learner, constantly engaging with them and setting up times to speak with them and getting feedback from them and discussing where they are in their learning journey and giving them advice or guidance on how they could move forward. And they can manage and practice ongoing and collaborative learning. This isn't a process that happens by the learner alone, but it happens for the learner within his or her professional environment, within the classroom, and so it's with other students. So it's important that the instructor is there to guide the student in that process. And also it's important that they be able to apply systems thinking and be able to look at things from a holistic approach and not just from one view. Next slide, please. Okay, some of the instructional methods that we can apply, and these are in more detail in the paper that I've provided, are ways that we can, as instructors, realize this kind of environment where students feel confident in self-determined learning. What I've often experienced is students will say, I don't feel comfortable with this because I want you to tell me exactly what I need to do. So students need to be in an environment where they feel safe, to learn, to make mistakes, to really engage in learning and know that they can trust their instructor, to guide them. So it's very important that there is a pedagogy of care within the classroom. Teacher presence is critical because not necessarily that you're hovering over the student, but the student knows that you're there if they need that kind of support, if they need your guidance, so that they know that they can come to you. Interaction and dialogue are, of course, also very, very important. Dialogue in the sense of it's a meaningful exchange between students, between the instructor and the students. Even though the student is going on their own learning journey and they're determining what they learn, there's still interaction and dialogue with others in the classroom because it's a wonderful opportunity for students to learn from each other as well. Another instructional method that we use within self-determined learning environments is authentic assessment. And that really, within my program, for example, we do not assess the students' work or give them official grades until the end of the semester. We provide them with feedback throughout the semester. We give them pass-fail as kind of a marker. Where are they? Are they doing well? Do they need to improve in certain areas? And then they can move on to the next assessment. And we also have portfolios where they can store their work and where they can have their reflections on their learning experience. And so that gives us a real holistic view of the students. I've actually just published a paper on this together with Victoria Marin, how we do this within the MTEL program. So feel free to check into that if you're interested in how we do it within our program. Another really critical aspect is personal learning environments. And that's not, for me, that's not a tool. That's not where you say, okay, I've got a learning management system. That's my personal learning environment. A personal learning environment is exactly that. It's personal. I define what it is that I want in that learning environment. I determine how it is that I best learn. And so what I try to encourage with my students is that they're able to define how am I going to learn? Where am I going to get my information? And then they construct this personal and learning environment that may be just in the classroom, but may also be outside of the classroom. A good example of that is Twitter. One of the assignments that I give to my students in the past is that they follow a researcher on Twitter, and then they report back on it or reflect on something that a researcher has published within their learning journals. And that relationship continues outside of the classroom. So it isn't just something that is during the semester, but which also occurs after the semester is over. So they're starting to build this learning environment, these resources that they continually go to support lifelong learning. Next slide. I think those are all the slides. Yeah. These were actually questions for the audience, but I'm not sure if those can be answered at this point. But they might be questions that you can ask yourself as you approach self-determined learning in the classroom. Okay, that was all I had today.
Спасибо.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and for an important topic. Of course, when we discuss new pedagogical concepts, we do see that 90% of everything that has been discussed there has existed under other names maybe, but nevertheless, appearance of new concepts always defines appearance of new reality. And it is very important to be very careful in perceiving those peculiarities which are being discussed by scientists in order not to omit important things which are happening in the process of teaching our students. Thank you very much. I hope that questions will arrive closer to the end of our session. But right now, I'd like to give floor to Arts Bozkurt, PhD in Anatolia University from Turkey. Of course, when I've been inviting him to our section, I felt myself as a person who tries to put a big eagle into a small cage, because the energy and the scientific interest of ours is great. And I had an opportunity of seeing him in action when back in May he started great case study on changes which happened in education in the spring, and he has covered 65 countries. So I thought it was aventuristic, but nevertheless, in the course of 1 month, all the materials were collected, worked, edited and completed and published. I never seen such energy, and I'm still being impressed after this work. And also it was really nice when the Ars name was in the program of the conference. Many people in Russia said, wow, that's great, we've read his articles, this is wonderful. So I was also really happy on such a great feedback. So with a great pleasure I give floor to him. Ars, welcome.
Okay, you can set my presentation. Thank you, Gennady, for the opportunity to meet with the Russian College, and I am really happy to be here. Hello, everyone. Privet, Russia. I will speak slowly to help the translator. Let me briefly introduce myself. I am Aras Bozkurt, an associate professor of distance education at Anadolu University, Turkey. Today, I will present my speech entitled Communication, Interaction, and Motivation, following third footprints of distance education. Next slide, please. Distance education is not a new term, and it has at least 3 centuries recorded history. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we swiftly moved to online distance education. We regularly talk about it, but what do we literally mean when we say distance education? There are many definitions, and one of the most cited one by UNESCO focuses on separation in space and time. Next slide, please. Similarly, legendary scholars more than years focus on separation in space, confine distance education practices to institutional organizations. But in fact, it is a relative term, and therefore there is a need to update the definition. Next slide, please. As a response to emerging need to update the definition of distance education, some other definitions that extend distance education to formal, informal, and non-formal territories, and most importantly, defines distance as a physical and psychological phenomenon. Next slide, please. In fact, the focus of transsexual distance is not a trending hot issue, but already articulated around 3 decades ago. For instance, Moore argues that there is an overemphasis on separation of time and space, and further argues that what matters is not the distance as we know it, but it is transsectional distance. Next slide, please. If we provide a simple and alternative definition for learning, we can say that there is no an action between these two parties, and learning is the action that parties interact. For a better insight and complete picture, there is a need to follow theoretical principles of distance education. Next slide, please. Accordingly, motivation is a critical component to sustain learning, and a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation fuels our social, emotional, and cognitive needs. Next slide, please. Interaction between and among different parties further plays an important role. Interaction is maybe first and uttermost requirement to create a learning ecology. We need interaction to spark learning. Next slide, please. While motivation and different types of interaction is vital, we need a social entity because we are humans and by nature we need social structures so that we can develop a sense of community. Next slide, please. These communities are necessary as we need to learn from each other, learn by experience, and move from peripheral to core of the community to shine and blade our knowledge. Next slide, please. But if we need a meaningful learning experience, we need teaching, cognitive, and emotional presences because learning is a complex process and we have to provide a right mix. Next slide, please. If that is the case, is there a magical formula, all these necessary elements of distance education? Unfortunately, there is no single formula, no single technology, no single strategy, and no single theory. Next slide, please. Now it's time to go back to origins and genesis. In contrast to general assumption, distance in space and time are not real barriers. On the other hand, transactional distance, if we cannot listen, is the real barrier. Nowadays, what we blindly do to lessen transactional distance is invest in hard technologies such as computers and learning management systems. Conversely, what we have to do is invest in soft technologies such as working solutions, best practice, and effective approaches. You know, the problem is rooted, the solution is simple, but we have to stop being lured by so-called innovative technologies and stop assuming that these technologies will descend from the sky and save the education. In contrast, we have to rely on wisdom and experience of the distance education field, which has already been articulated for a long time and left many footprints to follow. Next slide, please. Thank you for being here and listening to me. Blagodaryu was. I hope my Russian was good.
Большое спасибо, Арс, за
Thank you very much for interesting presentation. We're going to discuss it in the end of our session. And right now, I would like to give floor to our next speaker. You know, when I was writing my PhD thesis, one of my scientific managers, after getting tired from my ideas, in the end, she told me, please listen, psychology of education, it's something about client paying money, and there is nothing else, and no psychology in education exists. So then we have parted with this lady. I found another PhD thesis manager who's seen a little bit more than just money in education. But when you read some articles about education, communication in remote education, it's more about marketing. It's more about how to hold people, students. It's about how to help them in getting rid of their own money. And then this topic is not being discussed. But honestly speaking, it might seem that how bad is it, these business people, they're just caring about money. But if you will ask teachers the problem of how to hold the attention of the student, how to make so that they wouldn't drop out of the classes, this is also a very important problem. And in depth, these questions are closely related to each other. So our next speaker, Alexander Larinovsky. For Russian audience, he should not be introduced because very often we see him at different conferences. But very often he's invited to conferences dedicated to business where everything is rotated around how to earn $1 million on online education. Alexander knows how to earn $1 million and even more than $1 million on remote education, but also he has a deep knowledge of the content of the education. He understands what works and what helps students to achieve their objectives, and this is why his students are learning with them. Moreover, they have a unique opportunity to observe this process and a very big selection. They have thousands of teachers, hundreds of thousands of students. That's why analysis and generalization of this data is very interesting, not just for business education, but for any education which works with adult audience. That's why, with a great pleasure, I would like to give floor to him. And when I'm listening to the presentation by Alexander, I'm always want to sign under every word he says. Well, there is no option like that. That's why I've invited him to our section today, so that he's going to share his thoughts and ideas, and that he could share his experience of work in the Sky Inc. company, which grew on educating English language, but right now they're extending their spectrum on math and other disciplines. Alexander, welcome.
Добрый день, спасибо большое.
Hello, thank you very
Для меня
much.
большая
To
честь
me, it's a great honor
быть в
to
Pretoria.
speak in front of this audience.
Я слышу свое эхо, если можно его выключить, будет здорово.
I hear myself. If you can switch it off, that
Да,
would be
если
wonderful.
очень кратко про
Yes,
нас, у нас
briefly
сейчас
about
на
us.
платформе
Right
работает
now in our
порядка 15
platform, we have
тысяч
approximately
преподавателей со всего земного
15,000
шара,
teachers from the globe.
120 тысяч человек прямо
120,000
сейчас там
people
берут
right
платные
now
уроки,
are
практически все
taking
они
paid lessons.
работают по модели один
They
на
work on a
один
model
через то эти решения,
one-on-one
которые мы
through
делаем.
those solutions which
И
have been
вопрос
produced by us.
мотивации для
The question of
нас имеет
motivation
два
to
смысла.
us
Первый,
has two
безусловно,
aspects. The
бизнесовый.
first one is a
Это
business
от этого
aspect
зависит от того,
because
сколько денег мы
our
заработаем.
business
Но
results
главное,
do
на самом
depend.
деле,
But
история
most
работы с
important
мотивацией–
story in
это
our work with
сколько
motivation
времени
is
клиент
how
у нас
much
получится,
time
столько, в
the
общем, у нас есть
client is
шансов
learning with us,
на то,
the
что
more
мы
chances we
сможем
have to
ему
be
дать
able
какие-то знания,
to
сможем
give him a
его чему-то
certain
научить.
knowledge
Потому что
and
какой
teach
бы
him
там
something, because
крутой
no
и хороший
matter
урок мы не
how
сделали,
cool
какой бы
and
ни
good
был
lessons
прекрасный
we produce,
преподаватель,
no matter how good
платформа
is
и
the
все остальное,
teacher
это
or
все
the
не имеет смысла,
platform
если
or
человек теряет
anything else,
мотивацию и не
it makes
приходит
no
на
sense
урок.
if person
Ну,
loses
мы с
motivation,
вами
he's
все
not
здесь,
coming
конечно,
to
не
the lesson.
такие, но
We
вообще вот там вот на
are not like
улице
that, but
я
people
видел много
outside in
людей,
the street,
которые
I've seen a
когда-то
lot of
начинали
people
чему-то учиться и
who
бросали.
started learning
Собственно
something and
говоря, эту
dropped out. And
проблему
this is
с
a
мотивацией
problem.
есть
The problem with
то, с чем нам
motivation
приходится
is
работать,
something that we have to work
чтобы
with in order
сделать
to
клиента счастливым, потому что
make
счастливый клиент
client
приведет еще
happy,
там
because
20-30
happy
других
client
счастливых клиентов. А
will
счастливый
bring
клиент в нашем
24
случае это
new
человек,
clients to
который
us. And a client to
получил те
us is a
знания, за
person
которыми
who
приходит.
received the knowledge that he came for.
Значит, для российской
For
системы
Russian
педагогики, а у
system
нас
of
там
pedagogics, and we have
90% клиентов
90% of
это
clients.
люди из России,
These are
и,
Russian
соответственно,
people, and
преподавательные у
of
нас
course
примерно
teachers
там
and
тоже процентов на
teachers,
80
approximately
из России.
80% of them are
Не
Russians.
свойственно, то
For
есть российской
them, it's
педагогической
not
школе вообще
common in Russian
работать с мотивацией
pedagogical
не
school
свойственно.
to
Она
work
там
with motivation.
унаследована
It
от
has inherited
системы обучения в Пруссии, там
system of
взятой
Prussian
еще
education,
в
which
там,
was
начале
adopted in the
19
beginning of
века,
19th
вот уже и Пруссии
century.
нет, а система у нас живет
And
и
this
здравствует.
system, Prussia
И
does not
там
exist, but this
в
system still
российских
exists.
педагогических
And
вузах,
Russian
когда готовят
pedagogical universities,
преподавателей,
they train
они
teachers,
работе с мотивацией
and
уделяют
not
примерно
they are not
0
paying
секунд
attention
за
to
все годы
motivation. They
обучения,
spend only
поэтому
0
нам
seconds to work with
приходится
motivation.
набирать
So
в
we
этом
have
конкретном
to
смысле
work in this
достаточно
particular sense
профнепригодных людей,
very
их никогда не учили,
non-educated
как
people because
работать
they never been
вообще с целью
taught
мотивации
to
ученика,
work with
и в этом
motivation of
смысле
their
нам
students. And in
приходилось
this sense,
думать, как
we had
их
to
этому
think
учить.
how to teach
Но
them to work
забегая
with motivation.
вперед,
Okay,
когда
looking
мы начинали, у
forward
нас в
into the
среднем
future,
ученик
on
примерно
average,
3
our
месяца
student
занимался, это был в среднем жизни такого лайфтайм, показатели срока жизни клиента на платформе, сейчас средний, не максимальный, а средний показатель мы подняли до 11 месяцев. Конечно, работа с преподавателем является самым главным методом в увеличении этого показателя. Это то, к чему мы с самого начала стремились, к тому, чтобы научиться доставлять человека из точки А в точку Б, то есть когда он пришел и с какими знаниями хочет уйти, не потеряв его по дороге. Но когда мы начали это делать, мы столкнулись с тем, что актуализировать проблему работы с мотивацией для учителей в массовом подходе, я еще раз говорю, у нас большие числа педагогов, оказалось невозможно. По двум причинам. Либо они не понимают, зачем это вообще нужно, для них это просто какие-то слова, потому что, особенно в школьных предметах, куда ты денешься, ты все равно придешь на мой следующий урок, мне не нужно работать с мотивацией, у них это установка, вся их само школьное обучение.
And this is the way how they work in kind of simply blackmailing. And second one, these people are self-motivated and they don't understand why they have to work with motivation. You sit down and you work. Language is so wonderful, so interesting. What motivation do you need if it's a super interesting thing? So all our first attempts to work with motivation and tell about motivation, they failed previously. Then we have understood that it's impossible to solve it like that. We have to solve it by more precise methods, and we have packaged all educating activities on teaching teachers about motivation into a certain packaged rules. We started telling them that we have these rules, we have standards, and you have to comply to these standards. This is a very understandable thing, and inside of these standards we have imputed elements which work with motivation. So the first thing we teach them is the fact that on the first lesson, starting from the first class, you have to maximize your understanding in which life situations the person will acquire and apply these learnings. So the full line of questions in order to understand not just simply in travel or at work, but in which life situations they will apply, whether it's going to be mailing or live communications or messaging or calls, which topics, which frequency. And these objectives, afterwards, teachers should have them in front of their eyes with that particular student in order for teacher to remember what is to be done with these objectives. And honestly speaking, this is one of the most important stories, because the pupil, from the first minutes of the lesson, from the first lesson, has a feeling that he is being taught not some abstract person, but deeply they are interested in him as a person. And when somebody is deeply and sincerely is interested in ourselves as a person, then we sympathize to such a person. And as all the people, we want to be understood in the situation in which we find ourselves. So when we have when we have taught the teacher to follow these goals, then the next stage looks very logical for the teacher. The stages of lessons, we say that we definitely have to have some exercise. From the point of view of the teacher, okay, you need exercise, okay, that's wonderful. They warm up, they switch on in the process, but the fact that on those big numbers, approximately like we have like 15 million lessons that we have conducted during all this period of time, we have understood that it is very important what feeling the student has at the end of the lesson. And the feeling that I was speaking from the first minute of the lesson, respondents always speak about it, and this element of motivation, which to us looks like one thing, for the teacher another thing, for the pupils like a third thing.
The next phase is a review of homework. We understand that it's quite a personalized thing, it's quite obvious, but it's not less important that issuing homework assignments is based on mistakes and errors made during the class. Because while the teacher is correcting a student, the students start using this as a way of verification. So not memorizing their mistakes because they're always sure that there'll be the teacher correcting them should they make them. And if they're making the same mistakes and there's no progress and there's no motivation, because progress is a big factor of motivation. So basically teaching a teacher to assign homework based on the mistakes made, articulating it in such a way that, look, we're going to make this homework today because today you made several mistakes like this, and it's important that you focus on them and you never do it again. This would show the kids that they're being taken care of, that the teacher is engaged, and so on. The result of which being a habit that we try to instill from the first day of learning to always reflect and explain what has been acquired during a lesson, how to apply, for instance, each rule studied today, how can be used in practical life. So it all seems good, but it's not going to work on large numbers because however much we teach a person, you'll need to track them. So therefore, we use quality assurance that helps the teacher. So we're reminding the teacher there are always these notifications. So there's this thing called language detector. It's not actually speech recognition. But we always try to make sure that students should speak not less than 60% of the language. So we have this indicator on the screen showing the educator the share of time spent by the student speaking or by the teacher. Also, there are ways to remind the teacher to look at the camera rather at the screen, rather at the phone, and so on. So we basically teach teachers to comply with the motivation rules, and the same applies to students. It takes the form of a game for them. So if you take 600, 800, 1,000 teachers that we cover a month, so we get it to work. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Alexander. This indeed is very exciting. All the more so that in our Russian reality, the situation is such that the teacher, either in high school or the university, they just enter the classroom, the door gets closed behind them, and as a rule, nobody knows what's happening behind it. And even if the students are happy, it's not always because of high teaching performance. We know that there are educators who are quite good at entertaining the students, but not so much in teaching them. So, for instance, my employees also got quite inspired by your achievements, and because all of our education is happening online, we also use this. We developed a teacher support tool. It's not really a teacher tracking or surveillance tool, but we call it support. We want the computer to remind us whether we comply with certain rules or whether there are certain areas where we go over them. It's quite useful because sometimes we're tired, sometimes we're in a bad mood, and we feel that the rules can be bent, and when you have these reminders, it comes in quite handy. So thank you very much. Please stay with us. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to our next speaker, Maria Lebedeva, leading research associate at the Russian Language Institute, named after Pushkin. And if Alexander is teaching everyone to speak English, so Maria is actually being busy teaching other people to speak Russian. It's also quite a serious endeavor. Also, Maria is quite a popular speaker in different conferences. But she's also a very thoughtful and serious online education researcher. So we are quite happy to have her among us joining this session. So she's going to talk about pedagogical communication from the viewpoint of a philologist and a linguist. You're welcome, Maria. Thank you, colleagues. Hello. I hope that you can hear me quite well. It appears that I can do it this way. I would first like to say a big thank you to Father Gennady for sending this invitation, and apologize to him for not being a very highly disciplined participant. But now I am part of a special operation in a kindergarten, in a separate room. My kid is probably for the first time without me, so it's a separate challenge for me. Yes, indeed, I wanted to tell you today how, from the communication theory position, we can treat online learning. And also I'd like to share what we've seen, what we saw in spring when the whole educational community had to swiftly switch to the online mode. But before that, I'd like to say a few words about what Aris has wonderfully done, remembering Moore's transaction theory, where it's so important to define a distance between the learner and the teacher, the learner and other learners. This reminds us that indeed an important part in learning is communication between the counterparties. And it wasn't only Moore who talked about that. The idea is quite well known. The next slide, please, shows a similar concept proposed by his colleagues, Anderson and Garrison, in 1998. They were also saying that students interact with others, with students, teachers, and themselves. And all these three types of communication, and we now have to add content and interface communication. So all these types of communication are being studied, researched, and taken account of in designing distance learning. The next slide. A theory that I feel very close to. It's the community of inquiry, and the concept or a construct that is being used in this theory is the concept of social presence. We understand that learning indeed is the most effective when a community emerges. And to maintain this community, the teacher has to apply more effort, and that's for sure, because students, when they are separated belong spaces, so they don't have common points of interaction around which the communication could emerge. So in the normal education, it happens in such a way that students travel to the university, they meet each other in buses, and when entering the building, they get a cup of coffee, they talk during the breaks, and so when they are in the audience, in the classroom, so there are a lot more opportunities for offline learners to communicate. Whereas when it comes to online learner, there are fewer such touch points, And so therefore, this model of social presence comes in quite handy where specific pedagogical efforts can be applied to foster this communication in distance learning. So all the researchers who were working before the spring of this year, it appeared that they had quite a good understanding. But then this shock happened, and then the next slide shows the next slide, please. So this is what happened this spring. So even though we had known a lot how to design distance learning, how to do it well and effectively, in reality, for many reasons, things went a bit differently. So why did they go a bit differently? And what exactly went differently? So that was the subject of my research. This research was done based on our institution. We have Russian students who graduate from the philology department, and we also have foreign students who are studying Russian as a foreign language. So everybody had to switch to online all of a sudden. The institute tried to offer everyone as much help as possible, and that included methodological support. So a lot of teachers had some problems with that, and I'll try to look at those problems from the viewpoint of the communication theory. I believe there are a lot of things can be used in online communication to tell people what's happening. Like there are a lot of memes. So this meme about black boxes, when it's not clear what's happening at the other side of the screen, whether the student is listening or whether they're doing something else, whether they're prepared to communication or not. And the next slide is also a joke that characterizes the communication that emerged during this pandemic time learning. So this learning experience is more like the medium sessions. So can you hear us? Do you see us? And so on. So in order to consider the communication situation that emerges in online learning, I took the Roman Jacobson communication model that he proposed in 1975. It's quite a classic model framework where we understand that every communication, whether pedagogical or not, includes at least two persons, sender and receiver, who periodically swap places. And there are three units that one way or the other affect the communication and the success of communication. Context, its channel, and code. And while moving from attended learning to distance learning, where we just took the attended learning model and transferred it to the digital environment, like we had some schedule and we applied it to a schedule of a Zoom session, of Skype sessions or something like that. Not making any difference in the material to be delivered. It was quite a typical situation this spring. So in this situation, everybody understands that the sender and receiver of the information did not change. These are the same teachers and students. The message, the content, did not change either. But the remaining three units did change. Of course, the channel changed. Now it's not attended face-to-face communication. It's communication over the net. But also the context and the code have changed. And we can actually take a closer look at these units to see what exactly changed, how it changed, and how it affected the learning process. The next slide. In terms of the context, what changed, on the one hand, was the spatial conditions. So actually, the venues, the places from where people learn changed. On the one hand, one would think, what's the difference? You can see even a lot of benefits from that, because now you don't have to spend the time commuting. You don't need to, exert efforts to find the right room. But during this emergency switch to online learning, it appeared that a considerable constraint to create a community, to build effective communication during the learning process. The big impediment was the lack of a unifying physical space. This is something that I've already mentioned earlier. I hope you can hear me. It appears my video has got frozen. I hope you see me quite well. So a drawback of this unifying physical space that students and teachers alike got used to resulted in creating less motives for communications. So it appears that in the real world there were a lot of different touch points and things that a student, that teacher could do to keep the community together. And the same applied to students. So when this physical, unifying physical space got away, it appeared that this whole community broke down and students turned into just separate individuals connecting to this service. This became especially relevant for foreign students. If Russian students were continuing their communication even in the online environment, foreign students really got away. A lot of them had to go away to their mother countries. And the big problem, and we got that from interviewing them, was that felt that they were no longer part of the community. Also, if you come back to the previous slide, please. A couple more important things was the noise that was not common to all the participants. Sometimes the teacher could not even notice this noise, and it wasn't quite easy to understand. And also a big problem was the appearance of unwanted observers. Could be family members, could be parents, could be partners, or people living in the same dormitory in a student hostel. It appears quite a serious problem, because it made students not want to take part, in the dialogue, not to speak out, turning them into silent observers. And this slide is about the change in temporal conditions. The biggest difference between online and offline turned out to be connected to the significant roles of asynchronous communication. So in offline sessions, students ask questions to each other, to the teacher, or maybe they can ask some questions right after the event, but still the communication point is the lesson itself. In online learning, async communication, asynchronous assignments start to play an important role. So on the one hand, it proved as another proof that it's not totally effective to move offline practices to the online world, because online allows using students' times better in the async mode. But at the same time, async communication started to fill the time of the teachers. 62% of teachers said that the amount of individual support they provided to students outside classes increased after the transition to online learning. Students started writing them emails, asking questions. So these questions were not being asked in groups. So therefore, the time the instructor started to spend on communicating with students started to grow. And the last slide that also talks about the factors that has changed after the switch to online that can also be connected to the communication theory. They're about the change of the code. I deal with this problem quite a lot. Communication in the online environment, in the digital environment, is somewhat different from face-to-face communication. Let's call it a non-digital environment. The point is that we perceive information differently in a digital environment. We interact with it different. We start using different strategies and patterns to work with the content and different patterns to communicate. We start perceiving things much faster in the digital environment. In the digital environment, we get used to being able to choose both the scope and the time of communication. And we can also choose formats. The digital environment is multimodal by its essence, by its nature, which means that it includes different modes. The texts that are being exchanged can be written, can be oral. The visual component is also very important. And there's also this ability to choose all the time whether I want to hear this information or watch a video, use this time or choose another one. And it turns out that this peculiarity of the digital environment is not taken account of by a lot of instructors. Instructors take on the role of a talking head and tend to forget that digital support plays an important part. Also, they we're forgetting that the digital environment is interactive by its nature, which means that students expect being able to talk back. So a talking head turned out to be an ineffective format. A lot of students during the pandemic, and a lot of students said that this was the biggest turn-off for them in terms of the perceived quality of education. Also, switching to the digital environment, we lost an important aspect that's there's an eye contact. When an instructor enters a classroom, they often say that they can understand everything just looking at the eyes of the students, understanding who are listening to them, who are understanding them, who are not. In the digital environment, we don't have this eye contact. So digital platforms sometimes offer some tools to replace it. For instance, some ways to show icons or emoticons, like to show that you want to raise your hand, maybe to share your mood. And also a lot of students, also because of the fact that they have to work in a suboptical physical environment, they were disabling their cameras, and even some teachers were disabling their cameras. So therefore, almost 76% of the interviewed students said that it was easier for them to understand the other participants during the lesson after they had their camera turned on. But as we found out, such situations were quite rare. As a rule, there were always students with disabled cameras. It appears that it's everything that I wanted to share today. Oh no, sorry, the last remark. So, there's a hypothesis that we have started to research. So, dissatisfaction during the emergency distance learning era correlates with pedagogical communication issues. And in order to verify this hypothesis, we ran a research, the results of which I have shared with you. And looking forward, we plan to maintain quality of research on educational communication, including interviews and discourse analysis of online lessons using the social presence framework, looking where we can see some drawbacks. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope that everything went well. There were no technical problems during the presentation. I'll be happy to take part in the discussion at the end. Thank you, Maria, for an exciting presentation. And now I have the pleasure to introduce to you our final speaker today. But you know, when a tourist group is trekking somewhere in the nature, so they put the strongest and sturdiest people in the front and the end of the file, not in the middle. So the fact that Mark is the last speaker today does not mean that we don't value his talents. It's quite the opposite. Mark Brown, director of the Digital Education Institute of the Dublin City University, he is exactly the person who can save any event, even if none of the speakers today could join us except for Mark. I'm sure we would have found this time quite exciting, and I'm sure that everyone who's had the opportunity of talking to him and meeting him would say the same. Mark is an extremely broad-minded person, so I would call it a one-man band, rather. So I asked Mark to be the last speaker today, and I'm hoping that with his flexibility, he will also take account of the previous presentation, and his presentation will be the coda to this session, but not to the whole conference. So over to you, Mark.
Кажется, у нас подвисло видео.
I think the video has frozen.
You can start your presentation.
Mark, you can start your presentation.
Thank you for the warm introduction. The term unboxing has particular meaning on the internet. My next slide, please. It's a somewhat bizarre and often lucrative craze that occurs on YouTube as people video themselves unwrapping gifts. If I could have my next slide, please. It's about a brief thrill that we all get when we anticipate and unbox a new gift. But like many claims about the value of new technology learning, the thrill usually doesn't last very long when you unbox something new, because the gift is often discarded to the back of the cupboard. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. However, as the image on this slide of the Jack in the Box sometimes shows, it's hard to put things back in the box when they're already jumped out. So the move to emergency remote online teaching is a bit like this. Is online teaching now here? And if so, if the Jack is out of the box, or the Jenny, sorry Jenny, then the question of what works and why is even more important. Next slide, please. But as we know from Diana Laurillard, using new digital technology to improve education is not rocket science. It's actually much, much harder than that. Given the focus of today's discussion, Laurillard's conversational framework is highly relevant, but I've chosen not to share this theory with you. You've already seen many other theories, because this theory just helps to show how complex learning really is. Next slide, please. Instead, I like to keep things as simple as possible. As Einstein once said, if you can't explain it simply enough, then you don't understand it well enough. This seminal publication from Sfard back in 1998 identifies two root metaphors of learning: the acquisition metaphor and the participation metaphor. What's really important is that good teaching, irrespective of the delivery mode, needs to draw on and enact both metaphors, not just one. Next slide. In the time remaining, I'm going to briefly illustrate using three personal examples how highly engaging methods of online can promote both metaphors. In particular, I want to illustrate through practice, rather than complex theory, how engaging, rich online conversations can truly move away from what I call the traditional pump, dump model of online teaching and learning, where the emphasis is on delivering content. Next slide, please. Has anyone had the experience of online role play? It can be great fun and highly engaging. I have used asynchronous online role play as a signature pedagogy where we explore a particular issue or problem over a couple of weeks using low-tech discussion forums. Each person's allocated a particular role and using usually a persona. Perhaps next slide, please. Each person is allocated a persona which often has a degree of humor, as illustrated in this one called .com. Everything comes together asynchronously for debate and to make a decision about a particular issue during a simulated community meeting. Next slide, please. I don't have time to explain in more detail how all this works, but as you can see from this student comment, the emptiness of role play is a real strength, as it truly engages students in conversations. Learning is through discussion, and something students really enjoy. Indeed, they're often sad when it finishes. Next slide, please. My first lesson then about good online teaching is that rich storytelling underpins it. Learning is the story. We need to give teachers and our learners more opportunities to tell their own stories, particularly to reduce and enhance the transactional distance. Next slide, please. My second example builds on this point and involves the use of scenario-based learning. In this case, the software is called SPL Interactive, which allows teachers to design their own real-world scenarios for teaching online. Students have to make choices depending on the nature of the real problem. Next slide, please. This example illustrated here comes from a very real business scenario intended to help students understand the ethics of doing research. The learner lives through the scenario as the main character and is placed at the center of these decisions. In this particular case, they are the manager of a large company about to undertake a research project for their MBA degree. However, they plan to use their own staff as the research sample, which raises really serious ethical issues. The whole thing turns to custard when the staff refuse to participate. Next slide, please. Again, I don't have time to elaborate on the example, but the takeaway is how the online learning experience and acquisition of new knowledge is embedded in authentic learning contexts. This authenticity is crucial to promoting high road transfer of learning where their knowledge can be applied in real problems and situations. Next slide, please. My last example comes from a very recent experience where, in response to the COVID-19 crisis, we co-designed with students a free online course through the FutureLearn platform. The basic assumption of this course is learning how to learn online is now an important life skill. Notably, a team of students also helped to facilitate the course as we recognized that much of the knowledge of how to learn online is already distributed amongst the students. Expertise is distributed. Next slide, please. As this slide shows, understanding how learners feel and their emotions was also a crucial part of the course. We sought to personalize and locate the learning experience in their own world. Most students began feeling really anxious about having to learn, but grew in confidence as they worked through the course. In this sense, the course really emphasized emotional presence. Notably, over 5,000 learners participated in the course, with more than 50% of them completing it. The course generated thousands of discussions and conversation posts with lots of positive comments, as this next slide illustrates. Do the next slide. Thank you. Overall, the evaluation that the students gave for the course for its quality was 4.7 out of 5. Next slide, please. It follows that my final takeaway from this example is that the importance of designing for participation and personalization of learning experiences in contexts relevant to the students' real-world problems they face. Next slide, please. So, to conclude, I have two final brief remarks. Firstly, part of the answer to the question of what works and why lies in SAP, storytelling, authenticity, and personalization. Next slide, please. Reflecting beyond these very brief examples and the experience of emergency remote online teaching in response to the COVID-19 crisis. We need teachers willing to break out of the box, to reimagine more active and transformative online learning experiences. This is the great challenge for the future. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, Марк.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was really interesting, and I would like to say that in Ireland, we see very serious attempts on all the levels, starting from the government, and efforts applied for the development of pedagogical education and keeping pedagogical skill on a very high level. That's why our Irish colleagues have a lot of things to share with us. We have completed the part of our presentations, and I would like to say that usually I'm a very strict moderator and I keep the time frames, but today speakers were really lucky because I was disconnected during their presentations and I could not influence the time and duration of their presentations. That's why today they were really lengthy. But nevertheless, if we will do as it is usually done at some other conferences, so thank you very much for your presentations. We don't have time for Q&A, and we will destroy everything that we teach in the theory. If we say that dialogue and communication is the most important thing, and instead of this, we will offer a set of talking heads on the screens, by this we're going to show our two-sidedness. That's why we do have a possibility for discussion, and maybe we will commit a small crime and we will take time of our break for our discussion, but nevertheless I would like to do that. We did have some questions in the chat and some questions that came to us just before the beginning of the section. Possibly we're not going to be able to ask all of them, but most important ones I would like to verbalize right now. Question number 1 to Jennifer Roberts. According to your opinion, what are the main barriers for publications of Russian scientists in the international magazines dedicated to distance learning, and how these barriers can be overcome by Russian teachers community, according to your opinion? We cannot hear you for some reason. The sound is off. Can you switch on your sound, please? It's not coming. Thank you.
Мы вас не слышим.
Unfortunately, the sound is not coming. So then, I'm sorry, I will stop you for this second, and I will ask question to Alexander Larinovsky while studio tries to reconnect you. Alexander, I have even 2 questions to you. I don't know how does it comply with your experience, but I was asked, what do you think? What is the most important factor which formulates and helps teachers to use more transformative approach to the usage of new digital technologies and use them not as they have been using them yesterday for common. Can you give a comment to this, kind of a general comment? I think the answer is going to be very simple. Teachers will be an extra link in this thing. If you will take this piece of hardware and you know how multifunctional it is and what things it can do, and you know, if you will stop 10,000 people on the streets and ask them how many functions do they use, usually they use 5 functions. Send a message, read a message, listen to music, play a game, and maybe something else like Google something. That's it. Why teachers should be different? They are the same people out of these 10,000 people of sample. Each one of us has this reaction of thinking. We are slowly moving to new technologies. How long the online trade exists? How many people have been using them before pandemics? Right now, pandemics have increased this percentage of people using online training. When something becomes common, as soon as the teacher sees that his time is being saved, during the quarantine, they've launched a service which automates the homework check. And up to 80,000 teachers have adopted this system in 8 weeks without any state support channels. This was just by the gossip, distributed among them. You do something that teachers adopt as something useful, they immediately start using it, at least during the quarantine. Thank you. And now I immediately would like to ask the second question that I've had. If it is possible, how can we personify the education? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay. Jennifer, were the studio able to switch on your sound? Can we check? Alexander cannot hear me now.
Yeah, I think I've sorted it out. Can you hear me?
Да.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So to answer your question then about barriers to publishing in international journals, I think there are a couple of points here. And the first one is language, and you see what I said. I'm trying to sort the sound out here. What I said is most of your publications have been in Russian journals, and you're not particularly publishing in the internationally accepted distance education journals. And I know it's difficult, but if you look at all the countries in the Brics Consortium, none of them have English as their first language. So I think that's been one of the big reasons. Another one is that we have to adopt a culture of sharing and collaboration. Very important. What we normally do is we like to hold onto our work because we're very proud of it. But with the whole movement towards open education, we've got to open up our research to everybody in the world, publish in those other journals and not necessarily in our own ones. Another one is that we don't really have enough research articles. In Russia, if we said there's only 49 articles from the last 5 years, I think we have to improve upon before we can start publishing in international journals. And finally, we need institutional support. We get pushed to focus on our teaching practice, but we have to be allowed time to carry out research.
Спасибо, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jennifer. I would like to say if I will address this question to any other participants, it doesn't mean that others cannot speak about this topic. Marie, maybe you would like to add about this particular topic as one of Russian scientists who is being published in such magazines. Looks like my sound is not coming. Maria Lebedeva, the question is to you. Can you give a comment to what you just heard from Jennifer from the point of view of Russian researcher? Okay. Alexander? Can at least you hear me? Looks like we have internet problems. My apologies. So I'm not going to elaborate too deep on that, and I will ask a question to Ars Boskart. What is the most important advice that you could give to teachers that want to help their pupils to build learners' communities? And this is a question to Ars Boskart. And do you know, can you give an advice to some empirical studies which are related to relations and communications in online education?
Hello, I think you can hear me. My answer is that I think the key point is to create a learning community or learning ecology in which each of the learners can feel the seat that they can be comfortable. It's providing personalized educational guidance. Each learner is unique, like our parents, and they have different goals as well as different needs. However, that if we want to build such a learning community to know them, for instance, process in a simple I write interactive CV in which they write about their favorite songs, leisure time activities, etc. By doing so, I know that so other members in our government get the opportunity to know more about their peers. Another approach is pedagogical caring and learners as they are. Our brains and minds are nurtured by knowledge, yet our hearts and souls are nurtured by care and love. Of course, learners have hearts and souls, and pedagogy as an individual business should be beyond cognitive objectives that concern our brains and minds, but should include effective concern our goals. And if we can achieve this, learning communities that really serve for our learning purposes.
Благодарю, Арс. Я не знаю, насколько всем было хорошо.
Thank you, Ars. I don't know how others people heard. There were some difficulties with hearing you. I hope that our English colleagues were able to hear. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to understand everything. So I have another question to you. Can you make an example from your own experience on how can one support communications and relations between students in the online? Maybe some advices, tips and tricks, briefly.
I start by showing my social presence. There are always alternative actions that learners get in touch with. Besides, I develop active, and when needed, I show the important show that I am by their side and I am there to support them. Besides, I let them to use
Я поддерживаю их в их исследовании.
so they can feel comfortable. Versus, it is sometimes regular if I'm an instructor learner. I let them know that I am not an instructor in front of them. I am standing in front of them on the side.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. Alexander Larinovsky, has the sound came back to you? Thank you very much. So I will return back to you with the second question. Can we, and if we can, in the systems of mass education, personify education, and which motivational strategies we can apply in this situation? Honestly, the answer is not. Because good and powerful technologies, how can we build the curve of learning? They do not exist technologically yet. Or the endpoint can be described somehow by the proper measurements of what person knows and what he doesn't know. There's very little data, and this data is still too fragmented. So this will be in very approximate approach. And the personal trajectory with the consideration of the fact that we're going to be non-effective and approximate. Of course, this is much better than when we do broadcast for everybody. But honest technical breakthroughs, they do not exist yet. And we have to clearly understand that technology. Well, right now we are too behind from these technologies, and many things have not arrived to the. It's not that we have learned to do super breakthrough things and we perceive like something that we can do. Okay, thank you very much. It does agree with my experience that with all multiplicity of conversations about personification, personalized learning, really, when we speak about some big programs or mass programs, we can do very few things. Well, we can press on a certain initiative, we can provide more various possibilities for the person in the self-directing or self-determination mode. But in order to manage and to build some complicated tracks, before the University 2035 says that they know how to do that, but we're not going to argue with them. We want to see more convincing proof and results in this, because in theory it sounds wonderful, but when we come to practical experience, the management of such learning becomes so complicated and labor intensive that we can only speak that, well, artificial intelligence will come and will fix everything up. But before it comes, we have to wait. And remember that every student has their own peculiarities, and usually these peculiarities can be removed in a direct contact with the teacher more than in a contact with a system. Okay, thank you everyone. Maybe anybody else wants to add a comment on those questions? No? Then right now, I would like to ask a question to Elisa Maria. You've said that a teacher should give a student a full control over the educational process and development of the curricula and assessment whether they have achieved their goals. That's true. But in this case, we have another question. At which point of time teacher enters in the learning process, and at which moment of time he determines his role and function in relation to other participants and stakeholders? Because if this is like that, if the student is not just self-managed and self-determining, he determines himself from which point and at which point another person will enter and say that I'm your coach, I'm your teacher, and I play an important role in your educational process. So organizationally, how does this happen?
That's a really good question, Gennady. And I think it comes from the fact that our teaching environments are very structured and are based on an industrialized approach where the student comes into the learning environment and they are forced to have to learn the way that they've always learned, with the instructor telling them what they should know, how they should learn it, and then assessing them according to standardized learning outcomes. I think this can be achieved using self-determined learning, that we don't require the student to learn in this manner, but we have to move them out of that mindset where they are not allowed to make decisions about their learning. So the instructor needs to look at, where is my student in this process? If you take the pedagogy, andragogy, pedagogy, the PH continuum, and then say, okay, my student is here in terms of their autonomy, in terms of their maturity, I can structure assignments or the guidance that I give accordingly. So this would mean that I need to get a good picture of what my students have as skills and how they could use those skills to achieve the learning outcomes. So it's really a matter of continually moving the student toward more independence, which is very challenging as an instructor, because what you're trying to do is to move them out of their comfort zone so that they can really embrace the learning and engage in it on a deeper level. And many students don't want to take that step. My experience has been that moving them out of their comfort zone is very stressful for them. and that you have to be persistent as a teacher, providing them with guidance, giving them support as needed, but moving them toward this self-determined mindset, and eventually they will come around. Research has shown that students actually enjoy this type of learning much more, although it's a difficult process to get there, because they need to unlearn much of what they've already learned.
Таким образом,
So therefore, we must say that in the process of learning, we have to use all sorts of models and strategies at different phases of learning, depending on the extent of psychological preparedness of the learner. We just can't switch the whole university to just pedagogical or some other model. We need to master these strategies all at the same time, to be able to choose the one that will be motivating our learners best. Okay, thank you very much. I would now like to ask a question to Mark Brown. It's quite a general question. Quite often, pedagogues and innovators are being excited about the newest technologies, what people are hyping about, which means that either we all rush to do one kind of things, then another one. From your experience, what do you think the biggest hype in evoking thing in technologies, and why do you believe so? Mark?
Well, thank you very much. That's a really very good question. My tongue-in-cheek, if that expression translates, answer is that right now the technology that has the greatest hype, I think, associated with it is face-to-face teaching. Everyone wants to return, it seems, to face-to-face teaching, which is a technology. More seriously, but I am quite, partly I am quite serious about saying face-to-face teaching, because what we know is that the mode of delivery and the technology is not what makes the difference by itself. It's what you do with it. To more directly answer the question, I think it would be fair to say that artificial intelligence brings great hope and hype, but the long history of new technology in education suggests we need to be cautious and a little skeptical, or at least critical. My last comment is, there was a very interesting journal article published about 2 years ago in the publication produced by Herzer. And in this journal, it demonstrates empirically that the research we read has a positive reporting bias towards innovation. We only really read about the innovations in education that work. And most of the innovations in teaching and learning, in my experience, actually fail. But Lisa made the point, failure can actually be a very important learning experience. To end with an Irish quote, fail even better, and fail again. Thank you.
большое спасибо, Марк. Кстати, в чате...
Thank you very much, Mark. By the way, there was a question in chat about the phrase in your last slide of your presentation. I know that thank you for your attention in Maori language, I think, because Mark comes from New Zealand, so he always finishes his presentations with this phrase. It's just for the sake of time, he didn't choose to explain, just like he didn't traditional Haku dance. But today he gave us a great idea. And I would like to use this idea to wrap up today's discussion. Unfortunately, communication problems make our discussion a bit different. So if other participants are not going to object, I will draw a line below the list of questions. But Mark said the biggest hype today is face-to-face learning. Indeed, it is so. In the meantime, while academicians are trying to come up with, subtle definitions of what distance learning, e-learning, online learning, digital learning are all about, all these words have already lost their meaning to a certain degree. There's, chalk education, paper-based education. There's education as a universal way of bringing people to objectified images of the humankind. And all the technologies that we use in our day-to-day lives are being employed there. Alexander has shown us a mobile phone, showing that he doesn't find a lot of use for it either in day-to-day life or in education. And when the educators were switched to online education in an emergency mode, they started using things that they had been used to, phone, Zoom, or Skype at best, but it turns out that these tools are quite primitive. And it's not just a problem of education, it's a problem of our life as a whole. And if we are saying that face-to-face education solves all issues, but then you can ask a question, what's happening? Alexander has rightly said, so nobody's teaching us to work with motivation. And a lot of things are happening unconsciously. And so if we switch them to another technology platform, nobody knows how it's going to happen, how to take a student out of the comfort zone, except for running a test and putting the marks in the record books, just like it's done in traditional schools. So, of course, we shouldn't be putting rigid, strict boundaries between different modes of education. In each particular case, we need to solve specific tasks that learners and teachers face. And by the way, nobody mentioned administrators today. It's also very important. When they talk about communication, they're always talking about communication student to student or student to teacher, but there are also some people behind the scenes of which a lot depends on. And schools run a lot because of the work of the administrators, whom we don't see in the education process. And the impact of their work is quite high. But these are people and processes that stayed beyond the scope of research for the most part. I felt extremely happy seeing all the participants here with me today. I was thinking all the time, of course, how good it would be if we could just break up for lunch and continue discussions over the table. But unfortunately, we don't have this opportunity. We see this constraint, this restriction of the online format. And it's also an indication that our live format is much broader than online. Nevertheless, we're hoping that one day this will happen, and I'm still very happy that we have this opportunity of continuing collaboration. I must say that all the participants are open to joint research projects, joint publications, so you can get in touch with each of us, offer some ideas or initiatives, so that this conference should not be just a dot in a diary, but it could be a useful tool to help develop our community and bring the quality of online education higher. Many thanks to all the participants. We are now going to break up for coffee break. Again, I thank all the participants for great presentations. All the Russian language presentations have already been posted on the conference website. For the English language ones, we're expecting them to have available next week. So thank you all again until we see each other again.